Hello, Archie Dunlop here with Talking Astrology with Archie. And in this video, I'm going to be looking at the weekend of December the 6th and 7th, 2025. Now, this weekend there is a Grand Trine in water signs involving Mercury, Jupiter and Saturn. And I do want to spend some time considering, what this video, might mean. And in particular, I want to look at Mercury aspecting the Jupiter-Saturn midpoint. But before I go into this Grand Trine in detail, I want to first look at the overall astrology and the I Ching for this weekend. So here's the weekend's chart set for New York at midnight on Sunday the 7th. So as far as what's happening this weekend, well, it's always a good idea to start off with the moon. So the moon at midnight, as Saturday turns to Sunday, New York time, is in Cancer. So the moon moves into Cancer on Saturday morning at 1:54 a.m. London time. So for most of us, the whole weekend is going to have the moon in Cancer. Though if you are in Australia and New Zealand, it may not be until, I don't know, maybe sort of late morning, even sort of lunchtime on Saturday that the moon eventually moves into Cancer. So moon in Cancer is starting to make a conjunction to Jupiter. So this Moon-Jupiter conjunction in Cancer we have this weekend, I would have said is a pretty fortunate influence. The moon is strong in Cancer. It's in its own sign. Jupiter is exalted in Cancer. So, overall, a Moon-Jupiter conjunction is pretty lucky. And some of us may feel that this weekend, things are starting to move. We don't have to necessarily try too hard, and this also reflects the fact that we've got a Grand Trine. So if you look at Mercury is in Scorpio. It's sort of around 25 degrees Scorpio. It's making a trine to Jupiter, which is at 24 degrees Cancer, and it's making a trine to Saturn at 25 Pisces. So with this Grand Trine, it may just be that things are moving and that things can happen without too much of an effort. And some of us might just have a natural understanding of what is happening, what is going on. We might start to really understand the world in which we live. And I do regard this as being quite positive, and I think it can be quite a powerful weekend. And aside from what I've already talked about, Mars is making a quincunx to Jupiter. So there's Mars in Sagittarius making quincunx to Jupiter. Quincunx can be a difficult aspect. Mars-Jupiter quincunxes can be about perhaps not knowing quite how to expend our energies. We have a lot of energy, but what are we going to be doing with it? And it just might not be very easy, because if you think about it, Jupiter is in Cancer and Mars is in Sagittarius. So those two signs, Cancer and Sagittarius, don't at first sight have a great deal to do with one another. So, for example, Mars in Sagittarius might be about doing something that's exciting, wanting to do something different. But Jupiter in Cancer might have other ideas. It might be more traditional. It might want to stick to the straight and narrow. So the question is, how do we be ourselves? How do we work off our energy, but without necessarily causing too much damage? We don't want to be too confrontational. And I think that, some of us might feel a contrast between, on one hand, the desire for variety, but on the other hand, tradition. I mean, tradition is important, and Jupiter in Cancer can be about tradition, and there's always something in tradition. Tradition is not something that we should neglect, so perhaps we need to hold on to what we know and trust, but also do something different, do something that is interesting. So that's the picture for New York. I mean, and of course, this is just sort of a representative chart, and the positions of planets in Europe or Africa are not going to be so different. But if we turn our attention to Sydney, Australia, so this is the chart for kind of Australasia, Sydney being a representative of Australasia. It also sort of covers sort of East Asia. So we see that at noon. Well, in fact, I've got that chart wrong. I need to slightly fix that chart. That should have been the chart for the 7th, not the 6th. So I'm pretty sure that you will find that at midnight in Australia, in Sydney, that the moon will be in Cancer. Sorry, that's the chart that we need to be looking at. So yeah, at midnight, as Saturday turns to Sunday in Australia and New Zealand, the moon is at 6 degrees Cancer, and it's starting to make a conjunction to Jupiter. But that Moon-Jupiter conjunction just may take a bit longer to manifest in Australasia. But you still feel it. You've got Moon and Jupiter in the same sign. So I don't think that there is a huge difference between Australia and the Americas as far as what's going on over the weekend. And then there is the heliocentric picture, putting the sun at the center of the solar system, and the main heliocentric aspect is an opposition between Venus and Uranus. And this Venus-Uranus opposition, I mean, it could be exciting. You think about Venus as being about other people, perhaps about relationships, and it might also be about art and doing something that is interesting, being creative even. But with Venus opposition Uranus, things might be different, and other people might be behaving in a way which is slightly unusual, might also be exciting. Maybe people will turn up when no one expects it, or they might decide to just disappear. So other people can't necessarily be relied on with this Venus opposition Uranus in this heliocentric chart. But we should never forget that it is a heliocentric chart. It's not a geocentric chart, and so the heliocentric picture is perhaps more general, and it's not especially personal. And we have a quincunx. We have a quincunx between Mars and Uranus. So Mars-Uranus as a pair can be a bit unstable. They can be the pair can be erratic. It can sometimes be violent and can be accident prone. And so, with Mars quincunx Uranus, it does seem that there is an underlying tension. We can see it. This tension may not manifest itself in terms of us and our everyday life, especially as it's a weekend, but it may reflect itself in terms of what's happening in the world, what people are saying. And I'm thinking particularly of politicians, propagandists, whoever it is that's trying to influence the masses, and talking about people trying to get attention. There is this conjunction between Saturn and Neptune. I've been talking rather a lot about this conjunction between Saturn and Neptune, but I just wanted to just remind you of it, all the time, just to remind you of how close it's getting. I mean, Saturn and Neptune heliocentrically are just 7 arc minutes apart, and this does represent our fears, and this might also link with the Mars quincunx Uranus. This is perhaps people trying to get our attention, trying to make us afraid. Maybe politicians, what we're watching on the news, but maybe there's a lot of exaggeration here. So we shouldn't necessarily take things at face value. So that's the overall astrological picture for the weekend. And now I want to look at things from the perspective of the 12 signs. So these are my forecasts for the 12 signs for the weekend of December the 5th and 6th, 2025. Aries, you probably feel that you don't want to be doing too much this weekend. I mean, why? Is it really necessary? I mean, you are perhaps in a frame of mind where you'd like things to be exciting and you're always on the lookout for variety, but is it really so important? And if you're honest with yourself, there's nothing really that absolutely needs to be done, and it might be best, Aries, if you just focus on what you find to be comfortable, and you don't feel that you absolutely must do anything. Yeah, there could be external pressure. There's always some kind of pressure, and you might feel that you have to respond, but I don't really think you have to respond. And if you want a pleasant weekend, then I would have said the less you take on, the better. In fact, it may not just be about pleasantness. It might also be about good fortune. How can you have a fortunate weekend? It's perhaps a mistake to think that if you are desperate to be lucky, that you have to go out of your way to find this luck. I don't think that is true. And it may be that if you just stay where you are, then things will naturally come your way without you having to try. Now, there could be distractions, there could be pressure. I mean, there is a quincunx between Mars and Jupiter. So Mars, your ruler, is quincunx Jupiter, and this quincunx is a somewhat difficult aspect. Jupiter represents perhaps the need for stability, and as I was saying in the introduction to this video, when I was looking at the broad astrological picture, Jupiter in Cancer can represent the tradition and you having some respect for the past. It's not always about just action, plunging ahead. Sometimes you have to stop what you're doing and take stock of it all, and perhaps also bear in mind that the past may be a valuable teacher. So this Mars quincunx Jupiter, part of you certainly wants to forge ahead, but that that's not the right thing to do. You also know that you can't restrict yourself. You've still got to give yourself a bit of variety. So you can see the contradiction with this Mars quincunx Jupiter. And so I would have said that you can find all the variety you're looking for, all the excitement, all the meaning, without really having to go anywhere. So, if possible, you should be, resisting the pressure to do something that you frankly, you don't want to do. And, this doesn't mean, Aries, that you're being pessimistic or you're being negative, far from it. I think that the Aries mind right now is full of ideas, and you're aware of loads of possibilities, and you don't have to go out of your way to find these possibilities. And if something comes your way, you're able to interact with it very well, and the people around you will probably quite like your approach. You are someone who is positive. Aries naturally is quite a positive sign. It's positive, it's enthusiastic, and you can be positive and enthusiastic without having to take any risks, without having to go out of your way, without having to, do anything crazy, without having to attract too much attention. So I think, this weekend, things actually look quite good, provided you don't take on too much and you don't feel that you have to do anything, because I don't think you do. You're able to just get what you want just by just being yourself. If you're in a familiar environment, so much the better. Now, as far as other people are concerned, you do, I think, make quite a good impression. And, Aries does have a reputation for being someone who can stir things up, who can make people feel uncomfortable. But this weekend, I think it's the opposite. I think there's something quite reassuring about you, and it's not just that you should be looking for a place where you feel comfortable, but I think that you have the opportunity to also make other people feel comfortable. I mean, they have to be the right people. I don't think that it's a time when you should necessarily feel that you have to be socially adventurous, meeting new and exciting people. I don't think so. And so maybe you need to just make the most of what you've got and not feel that you have to be looking for anything or anyone that's new. Taurus. I think, Taurus, that things are really looking good this weekend. I mean, the moon is in Cancer. It's making a conjunction to Jupiter. And, the moon is in Cancer, and it is in the third house from Taurus. So, Taurus is, if you like, is the first house from a Taurean perspective. Gemini is the second house. Cancer is the third house. Moon is in the third house. And it is said that the moon joys in the third house. It's just a place where the moon works well, and it works particularly well when the moon is making a conjunction to Jupiter. And this conjunction between the moon and Jupiter does make you feel fairly enthusiastic and positive, and you've got sort of lots of ideas, and maybe other people have got ideas as well, and you're probably feeling actually quite good about yourself. You feel that you've got everything under control, and if you meet new people, then you're going to enjoy that, and because variety is important, and you're also looking for intellectual stimulation, and I think intellectual stimulation is something you can certainly find. And variety has many forms, and I think there's also geographical variety. And so with this Moon-Jupiter conjunction, it might be a weekend where there is quite a lot of short distance traveling. I mean, if that's what you want, you can go from one place to another place, and wherever you go, you have an influence, and you can make people feel happier about themselves, and so you can be a force for good. And this moon conjunct Jupiter, well, it's obviously it's in water signs, but it links up with Jupiter and Saturn. So the moon is making a conjunction to Jupiter. It's making a trine to Mercury, a trine to Saturn. So the moon becomes part of this Grand Trine. So we've got a Grand Trine involving Mercury, Jupiter, and Saturn, and then the moon kind of links up with it. And so Taurus, that might mean that things really, really come together, and you don't necessarily have to put too much of an effort into it. I mean, that is the way it should be. Now, it is possible, Taurus, that you will pick up on an opposition between Venus and Uranus, a sort of a heliocentric opposition. So heliocentrically, Venus is opposition Uranus, not geocentrically. Now, this opposition, is somewhat sort of abstract. That is the nature of a heliocentric chart. And you may not feel it, but if you really want to tune into it, and I think you can, this Venus opposition Uranus is about variety and the importance of variety, and perhaps feeling a need to do something that is slightly different, that isn't related to perhaps your normal Taurean self, looking for stability. Everything should be the same. We don't want to rock the boat, but you can rock the boat if you want to, and you'll be quite good at springing surprises. Now, this might link with your ability to move, so you might travel from one place to another. And I think we're talking about short distance traveling, and there's a short journey. You make the journey, and you suddenly appear, and you suddenly have an impact, and people aren't expecting you. And so maybe you can actually use this sense of the unexpected. It's easy to come to the conclusion that good old Taurus can be relied on. Taurus does the same old things in the same old way, and that I know is rather stereotypical, but there is a smidgen of truth there. But maybe it's a time, Taurus, to confound that expectation, doing something that no one expects, or perhaps it is assumed that you will naturally agree to something. And this weekend I would perhaps suggest that you think carefully about everything. You don't just agree to things just to make everyone happy. You express your opinions. And I think it's okay to express your opinions, because with this Moon-Jupiter conjunction, you can express your opinions without really causing any trouble. You'll be able to do it in a way that is very natural, and perhaps that's one reason why the Moon does joy in the third house, again, especially when it's conjunct Jupiter. So Taurus, I do think that it's looking like being quite a good weekend, and the Grand Trine in water signs is going to really help. As I said, Mercury trining Jupiter and Saturn, and don't forget that Mercury is in Scorpio. It's in your opposite sign, and so Mercury making that trine to Jupiter and Saturn may not just be about you. It may be about another person and how another person is behaving and how they're reacting and what they're saying. And it's quite possible that you're dealing with someone who is able to just create a bit of excitement and variety and movement, and also there could be an emotional side to things. This Grand Trine in water signs is very emotional, and there are things taking place at an emotional level that you may not be fully aware of, but someone is aware of it. And this Grand Trine in water signs just may say something about some of the people you come across over the weekend, maybe one particular person who really understands what's going on at many different levels. So it's nice to be wise, even to think that one is the wisest person around. But we should always consider the possibility that there might be someone out there who, at least in the short term, is wiser than us. Maybe they're more knowledgeable than us. Maybe they understand things better than us. It's okay. I mean, I can appreciate this. I've got Taurus rising. We shouldn't think we're that special. And so do give people a chance to express themselves and, to tell you what's on their mind. And perhaps you can learn from them and even take advice. So do take advantage of the social environment of everyone you meet, and just consider the possibility that someone might have some knowledge or experience that you just don't have, and that should be welcomed. Gemini, there is a lot of emphasis on Mercury. Mercury is, of course, your ruler. And this weekend, Mercury is involved in a Grand Trine. So we've got this Grand Trine in water signs, and this Grand Trine is, I think, pretty fortunate. Things work, things move, and so Mercury, your ruler, is it's trine Jupiter, it's trine Saturn, and it's also, at the end of the weekend, it makes a trine to the moon. So you are very connected with what is happening, and you should therefore make it your business to understand what is going on. Gemini has a reputation for being curious, for asking questions, and sometimes you can be too curious. Sometimes you can ask too many questions, but not this weekend. I think that you have a right to know. And it's quite obvious that you're going to want to know. And there are different ways of knowing. Okay, you can ask questions, direct questions. You don't necessarily have to be subtle about it, but consider the possibility that you can use your feelings to get an idea at least about what is going on. Because right now with this Grand Trine in water signs, you are connected to the collective. You can feel collective shifts as they unfold. And I think that you'll have a pretty good understanding of where society is going. And so this might mean that you can just slightly change your approach, and also do some research. You look at the news. Do understand what's happening. Don't think that it doesn't affect you, because it does. I mean, it may not affect you today, but it will affect you, in the end. And so, it's probably a good day for reading a newspaper or watching news programs. And, ideally, you'll be serious about it. It's not about being told what you believe anyway. It's about finding out. It's about finding out new stuff. And it is a time, Gemini. You shouldn't forget that what you believe in is not necessarily sacred. It can be changed. It can be negotiated. And with Pluto in Aquarius, I know Pluto's been in Aquarius for some time, and it's always in Pluto, always there. But I think that maybe that Pluto in Aquarius, is relevant to what's going on, because Pluto in Aquarius talks about what you believe in, and what is important to you, perhaps on a spiritual level. And you shouldn't assume that it's always going to stay the same, and your beliefs may shift a little bit over the course of a weekend. Maybe you'll see something or become aware of something which is challenging to what you believe in. And if you've got a strong belief, well, strong beliefs can be changed, especially if you're a Gemini. Geminis can do that. They're not tied to anything forever, and a lot of things are negotiable. And you also have to consider what you're picking up, what's going on. And you can pick up a great deal with Mercury being part of a Grand Trine. Now, from a sort of material perspective, there is a conjunction between the Moon and Jupiter in Cancer, and this Moon-Jupiter conjunction, I would regard it as a conjunction which is very fortunate. That it can be lucky, and it can be lucky in terms of money, and perhaps making more money, or finding a way of making money, or stumbling across an opportunity which you just simply weren't expecting. So be open to that possibility. I mean, I know it's a weekend and people are supposed to slow down over the weekend, but there may be just something that you can take advantage of. And don't forget, you are lucky because of this Grand Trine. One particular aspect involved in this Grand Trine is the fact that Mercury is trine Jupiter. And Mercury trine Jupiter in general makes you lucky, but also Mercury and Jupiter, the Mercury-Jupiter trine, may say something about how you relate to other people. I think that, at the moment, you have a natural ability to get on with people, and this should be quite fortunate in terms of relationships. Whoever the important people in your life are, I think that you'll know how to respond. And perhaps one reason for this is that you'll be more emotional than usual. You'll be able to sort of read the vibes, read the room better than usual. And so that will help you, respond in the right way. And because of this sensitivity, I think that, relationships could really prosper over the course of a weekend, which means existing relationships can improve, can sort of reach a new level even, and maybe you'll have a chance to get in touch with someone new. I mean, that certainly is a possibility. I mean, it does depend on your situation, depend on what you want, but Mercury trine Jupiter, it is a classic aspect for Geminis and relationships. I mean, I'm not saying anything is going to necessarily happen, but I think that it's something to bear in mind. And so if you are having a sociable weekend, then do see what people can offer, because I think they might have quite a lot to offer. Cancer. There is at the moment a lot going on. It's quite a busy weekend, and it's busy in a way that is mainly fortunate, especially if you're a Cancerian. So you have got the Moon and Jupiter currently in Cancer, in your sign. So Moon and Jupiter in Cancer, that's great. I mean, Moon-Jupiter conjunctions are known to be fortunate. They can work very well, and especially in Cancer, because the Moon is in its own sign in Cancer, Jupiter is exalted in Cancer, and Cancer, it's all in your sign. So you are able to, I think, do very well over the course of a weekend. Whatever it is that you're trying to achieve, that you're trying to get off the ground, I think you really can make it. And so be as positive as possible. And this Moon-Jupiter conjunction, it gets stronger as the weekend progresses. You find it's just easier and easier, to get things done, and you don't have to put in much of an effort with this Moon-Jupiter conjunction. Because the Jupiter is trine Mercury, Jupiter's trine Saturn. A lot of it is just very natural, and you are in control. And you're just going to be presenting yourself in a way that is really very effective, and you'll be able to communicate very well. You'll just know what to say, and if you need to engage in small talk, I think you'll be very good at it. Just talking about something, doesn't matter necessarily what it is, but you, Cancer, are going to be very good at giving impression that you're taking an interest. Now, you may not have any interest in what someone is doing about someone's life, but you know how to give the impression of taking an interest, and maybe that's a natural Cancerian trait. Cancerians, for example, if Cancerians are interviewing for a job, they're very aware of the person who is interviewing them, and in a way they're quite good at sort of flattery. It's kind of a flattery, but just listening to what someone's into and hearing someone's story, or even just fragments of the story, just gives Cancer the opportunity to feed something back, to feed some interest, to feed some empathy in, and that can be an effective strategy. So whoever you're around, whoever you're talking to, you really can at the moment create a very good impression without having to compromise anything at all. Because, at the moment you can be yourself, and I think that you'll, have a strong sense of your own creativity. And with Mercury making a trine to Jupiter, I think, Cancer, your sense of humour will be on good form. I mean, Cancerians do have a sense of humour. It can be quite an easygoing sense of humour. You'll know what amuses people. You'll know how to make people laugh, and so that is going to help you in terms of putting people at their ease. And additionally, we've got the Moon starting to make a trine to Moon making a trine to Saturn, and so with Moon making a trine to Saturn, that might say something about relationships, who you're getting on with, and the fact that you can get on with pretty much everyone. And if you're already getting on well with someone, well, you can get on even better. So really, Cancer, I don't see any reason why this weekend can't be really good. So I'm hoping that you're really able to make the most of it. Leo, you have ideas. You're thinking about some of the stuff you'd like to do, some of the stuff you'd like to get off the ground. And I think, Leo, you have a good sense at the moment of your creative potential. There are things that you can do very well. And if you know that you can do something well, then you should get on with it. Don't waste any time, and also don't feel that there's any pressure to conform or to worry too much about what other people are doing. Do think about you. Especially now with the Sun and Mars in Sagittarius, particularly the Sun in Sagittarius. Remember, the Sun is your ruler. The Sun is your ruler. It's in Sagittarius, so that should enable you to really just be yourself and do things that you're very, very proud of, and think about your abilities and your talents. Have you been giving them enough time? Because once you start tuning into something that you're good at, it will almost be sort of a virtuous circle, because you tune into something you're good at, you get good results, and because you get good results, you try even harder, and then because you try even harder, you get even better results. But to begin with, all of this might be taking place in isolation. It doesn't necessarily have to be about other people. Maybe you're just developing things on your own and just not feeling that you have to go anywhere. And your imagination is on great form at the moment, and there are things you're realizing, and you're getting new ideas, and none of it has to be talked about, I don't think. And it might be best that you don't talk too much, because if you do talk too much, well, that might spoil things, because you might get challenged, you might get criticized, and why would you want that to happen? So it just might be best if you just keep things as they are, and not feel that you have to do anything dramatic, and you can make some sort of private decisions about what is best for you, about what you want to do next. So overall, Leo, I think that this weekend is pretty constructive, but don't feel that you have to do anything, and don't feel that you have to socialize. So if you don't feel like meeting someone, if you don't feel like going to a party, don't, because in many respects you're going to be strongest when you're on your own, and when you don't have to account for yourself, when you don't have to explain yourself. In fact, that's the last thing you want to do. And I think that over the weekend you should really avoid people who are asking too many questions, and perhaps you should avoid situations where you're going to be asked too many questions. And that's another reason why this weekend you might want to keep yourself to yourself. I mean, I'm not saying you have to be a hermit, but a lot of the time, social interaction is just not going to get you very far, and you're going to be more effective if you're just in your own world, doing what's important to you, perhaps revisiting some of your talents, in your own way, making sure that you're in practice, and in that way, you're setting yourself up nicely for the moon's movement into Leo, because the moon will move into Leo at some stage. And okay, when does the moon move into Leo? I should. So the moon moves into Leo, if you're interested, on Monday. Well, if you're in the Americas, Sunday night the moon moves into Leo. If you're not in the Americas, then that will be sometime on Monday. So there is that changeover coming, and with the moon moving into Leo, I think that's going to give you sort of new confidence. But that's really not going to be until the beginning of a week. I mean, at least when you really feel the moon in Leo. And perhaps what you're doing now is you're making the right preparations. You're starting to feel good about yourself. You know that when the time is right, you'll be able to move things to the next level. And the moon in Leo should give you some new opportunities. And I'll be talking about the moon in Leo when I do my forecast for Monday. Virgo. Mercury is now in a Grand Trine with water signs. This Grand Trine is exact this weekend, and that does mean, Virgo, that things really are starting to happen, and you are able to really think straight. Perhaps recently you haven't always found it too easy to think straight, but I think now you can. And finally, quite a lot of stuff is beginning to make sense. So you're starting to understand, where the linkages are, and also, what is happening in this world. And you can pay attention to it all. You can see, what's happening in the economy, and it's all because of Mercury, aspecting Jupiter and Saturn. So with Mercury aspecting Jupiter and Saturn, that means you've got a link with the great chronocrators, the rulers of time, which are Jupiter and Saturn. And Jupiter and Saturn are maybe giving you information. They're telling you about what the nature of our time is and how our times are going to change. And you can see it everywhere. You can see how things are transforming. You have perhaps some insight into what's going on in the world if you're reading the newspapers, for example, or watching news channels. Whatever you're doing to get your news, it helps. And you certainly shouldn't steer clear of the news. You're thinking that current affairs is boring, it doesn't affect you. Of course it affects you. And furthermore, Virgo, you have the opportunity to make use of it all. And that's what's important. And now you might find the news depressing. The news can be depressing, and it might sort of indicate that everything is going from bad to worse. But no, not in your case. I think, Virgo, you're really able to get a perspective on things. You're able to understand where it's all going, and it perhaps doesn't matter what the news is. You can usually see the bright side. Okay, there might be news of tragedies, but if we're talking about news, for example, relating to the economy or to society, then you can pay attention to that, and you know where it fits in. And so perhaps, Virgo, you should start to consider yourself as, being something of a seer. I mean, a seer is someone who can see the future. The future is available. I mean, when I say available, an understanding of the future is available, because you see the details that matter, and you can sort of put them in order, and you can sort of create a narrative. And so if you do get an idea about the way things are going, okay, you can tell people about your ideas, but you can also plan for the future. And I think that's something that you really can do at the moment. So I think that this weekend, really is positive. And as far as other people are concerned, Mercury is making a trine to Jupiter. Remember, Mercury is your ruler. It's making a trine to Jupiter, which is ruler of Pisces, your opposite sign. So that indicates that there is a lot to gain from other people. You don't have to do things on your own. And with Mercury trine Jupiter, it's quite possible that relationships can work well, and they can be constructive. That's because with this Grand Trine, Saturn is involved, and so your constructive approach can stabilize certain relationships, and if you so wish, can sort of give them a certain permanence. But maybe it's not permanence isn't something that's particularly important to you. I mean, relationships have different dimensions. Some relationships can just last for a couple of days. Two people coming together, they have a purpose. If purpose gets accomplished, then they move on. They move their separate ways. And so that may also say something about the weekend. But whatever it is, Virgo, I think that you're able to really make the most of it, and I think you can also make the most of other people. So I'm quite optimistic about the weekend for you. Libra, don't waste this weekend. I think this weekend, could be very good. It could be, very constructive. And I think that maybe you'll have an opportunity to just finish off something that you had been working on. And yeah, it's important to just see it through. If you were to just do nothing over the weekend, you might lose the thread, and getting back to it at a later stage could be a problem. So keep going, Libra. If something is important to you, just make sure that you give it your best shot. And one reason for this is that there is a conjunction between the moon and Jupiter in Cancer. This moon Jupiter conjunction, it's really good. It's a terrific aspect, and it focuses on you and what you want to achieve, perhaps your ambitions for the future, or just maybe something you have been working on and you just want to be able to see it through. And most importantly, I think you enjoy it. Moon Jupiter is a favorable aspect. It's a happy aspect. And so if you are able, then really give yourself a chance and be as creative as possible. But it's not just about creativity. It might be about your ambitions and seeing that you've got an opportunity. And Jupiter is part of a Grand Trine. We've got a Grand Trine involving Jupiter in Cancer, Saturn in Pisces, and Mercury in Scorpio. Now, this Grand Trine in water signs, we've had several Grand Trines in water signs because we've got this Jupiter-Saturn trine, which is just going on for a long time. In Jupiter in Cancer, Saturn in Pisces. So whenever a planet moves through late Scorpio, it makes the aspect to Jupiter and Saturn, and Mercury is the final planet in Scorpio. And so we've had Grand Trines involving the Sun, we've had them involving Mars, and now it's Mercury's turn. And these Grand Trines are, I would have said, quite material. They're not just about imagination and having fun. I mean, we think about that in terms of Grand Trines. We think about things are running smoothly, our imaginations are running smoothly, we're having fun. But if you're a Libran, there might be a serious side here, and it just could be that you have an opportunity, Libra, to really get yourself together, and it might be very easy. And I know it's a weekend, and you're not supposed to be thinking about work and your ambitions, but you can, and perhaps you should. And maybe you have an advantage because it's a weekend. There is no pressure. It's an extra. You're giving your time to something important to you over the weekend, and it just comes together very easily, and you start to get an idea about what can be done, and you also start to pick up on your own individuality. And you shouldn't forget that in the heliocentric chart, there is an opposition between between Venus and Uranus. So Venus, your ruler, is opposition Uranus, and so that just gives you a chance to do something different, to confuse and confound. Maybe people have got particular impressions of you, and they're assuming that you're going to behave in a particular way. And right now, Libra, you're not a conformist, not at all. And it might be that you just do something or say something that just no one expects. And that's possibly a good thing. I think the problem can be that people do have expectations. And when people have expectations, the easiest thing to do is to fit in with these expectations because you want a quiet life. But sometimes the best approach is to actually show that these expectations are false, that no one can expect you to do anything or to be a particular person. You have to instead demonstrate your individuality. And right now, Libra, you're really able to demonstrate your originality. But it's the kind of originality that is tinged with ambition. You're original because you need to be original. because you want to stand out. Other people can be looking at things in a different way. Other people might be lazy. Other people might have different priorities, but you're not other people. You're able to do things your way. So I think it can be a very effective weekend, and don't shy away from material details, money, how things are organized, and of course your path forward. Maybe other people aren't ambitious. Maybe they don't want you to be ambitious, but you can be ambitious. And if you have an ambition, then this weekend you should see what you can do to move forward with it. So overall, Libra, I'm very positive about this weekend, but it's just important that you make the most of it and that you don't allow yourself to be distracted by other people who may not have the same priorities as you. Scorpio. Mercury is, very much in focus over the course of the weekend, and the reason for this is that, we've got a Grand Trine. We've got Mercury in your sign. Yeah, Mercury is still in Scorpio. Won't be in Scorpio for much longer. Mercury, I think, moves into Sagittarius early next week. Is that right? Let me just check that. So Mercury moves into Sagittarius on the 11th or the 12th. So yeah, next week it's not in Scorpio anymore. The Scorpio season is very much over, but that's next week. Right now, Mercury is in Scorpio, and it's trine Jupiter and it's trine Saturn, and I think that this Grand Trine should really work for you. Hopefully it's already been working for you. And Scorpio, things don't have to be difficult. If you want things to be easy, they certainly can be. And there shouldn't be any pressure with this Grand Trine. If you put in a very small amount of effort, then I think you'll be rewarded. And you could be rewarded, many times over, in terms of, how much effort you put in and how much reward you get back. I think you're dealing with a multiplier there. Your rewards are going to potentially be many times the effort you've actually put in. So, Scorpio, it's very important that you make the most of it, and don't feel that you have to hold back. With Mercury and Scorpio, you could say that Mercury is a planet of communication, and so before Mercury leaves Scorpio, you need to say what's on your mind, and you need to tell people how you feel, and engage with what's going on sort of intellectually. Use your mind, and don't be afraid of discussing your conclusions. And over the weekend, Mercury is making a trine to Jupiter. Mercury trine Jupiter. It's a good aspect, and this aspect could be quite elevating. There can be something quite spiritual about it. Especially as the Moon is making a conjunction to Jupiter, and you can perhaps start to see things in a new way. With Mercury, you might begin to just be intellectually engaging, and you're not thinking too far ahead, but then as soon as you start thinking about it, you have other thoughts and then other thoughts, and then you start to get an idea about something beyond yourself. And perhaps with Mercury trine Jupiter, you get the feeling that you are on the right path. And it's also connected with Saturn, and Saturn, Saturn may represent things that you deserve. Good things that you deserve, things that you so far have not had access to, and Saturn can provide them because the time has arrived. And that can be something that happens. Maybe you've done something good in the past, and you have perhaps felt you weren't rewarded for it. but now it's coming together. And I mean, I kind of get that idea. I don't know whether I should, mixing up Western and Eastern astrology, but from a Scorpio perspective, Saturn is in the fifth house. And, it's come back into the fifth house because, Saturn's in Pisces, because Pisces is the fifth house from Scorpio. And I believe that in Vedic astrology, the fifth house is called the house relating to Purva Punya, which I believe Purva Punya relates to past life credit. So I don't know whether it's about previous incarnations. It may just be about the past. If you don't believe in incarnations, in reincarnation, for example, but maybe something you did in the past, something you did that was very worthy in the past, and it could have been a previous incarnation, is now coming together in the present, and that might be how this Grand Trine in water signs is working. So I think that looks pretty good, and so maybe something is owed to you, and you'll finally get it, and you just have to be positive, and you can be positive absolutely this weekend. You can really think good thoughts. You can be aware of how things could go wrong. You could always be aware of what is the worst case scenario, but you're not going to allow that to completely overwhelm you. You can see what happens also if everything goes your way, and it also relates to how you deal with other people. You can help them see things in a positive way. So perhaps this weekend we're seeing the good side of Scorpio, perhaps Scorpio, at its best. But, there's no need to exaggerate. We do have a quincunx between Mars and Jupiter. So, it's possible you might take something too far or get distracted by something that isn't necessarily important. For example, money. You might decide that money is important, or someone might try to persuade you that money is important. And I think that if you spend too much time thinking about money, then that might spoil the weekend. Okay, you've got to be down to earth. You've got to make sure that the financial side of things is sorted out. But it just could be that something like money or some other material detail could just spoil things, and you have to have the ability to see through it and see beyond it. I mean, obviously, you need to be careful with money, but you shouldn't allow money to define anything. It really shouldn't. And so Scorpio, I think if you handle things right, I think it can be a weekend where you can really be very powerful, and you'll be feeling good about yourself. And I think you can also help other people. You can give them a blast of your positivity. Sagittarius, you probably are feeling a little bit serious. You know that things can't be trivialized, that some things do need to be taken seriously, yes, and perhaps you're able to see that. Maybe you have a view that just a lot of people don't share, and they're just zooming around. They're not thinking too much. They're just carrying on as per normal. But you have this different perspective, and maybe Sagittarius, it's a time when you can get an idea about how things might develop. Some people are rooted in the present. They're only thinking about the present. They're perhaps being quite hedonistic, but not you. You can see how things are going to develop, and that might indicate a degree of pessimism. I mean, if you see how things could develop in a bad way, but of course that does give you an advantage. If you know what's going to happen, then you can position yourself correctly. And right now, Sagittarius, you are in a position where you can benefit from things which are difficult, which are complicated, that maybe require some research. And so, Sagittarius, what are you going to do about it? I think it's important that you're able to go with it, and that you don't get distracted. There's no need to get distracted. Therefore, Sagittarius, focus on what you regard as being important, and don't allow yourself to be swept up with whatever else is going on around you, because it does seem that some people have different priorities, and they may be trivializing things which in their own way are really serious, yes. But perhaps people don't want to think about the future. But you, Sagittarius, I think you're quite capable of thinking about the future. And you're also quite good at showing your feelings, demonstrating to other people that something is important. So if you're angry about something, then I think you're going to be very good at expressing this anger. I think that you can be very verbal, but not verbal and just talking about loads of stuff for the sake of it. You can give the impression that something is important, and that means that you can be taken seriously, and maybe you can stop some people in their tracks. They think everything's fine, and then you remind them that it's not fine, that something has to be done. But if something is done, then that kind of changes the situation. Revolutionizes the situation, yeah, maybe. And so it's not necessarily a trivial weekend, and it is a weekend that you can be noticed. And one aspect we do have is Mercury trine Jupiter. So, Mercury trine Jupiter. Mercury is making a fortunate aspect to your ruler. This could be about an internal process, about you having a thought. Something occurs to you. You don't talk about it. You don't discuss it to begin with. It might be quite private, this thought, but you have this thought, and suddenly it all makes sense, and you work through it. And maybe it's something you notice. It could be something you read, something you're sent. It could be an email, whatever. It sets something off, and then you get it and you understand it. So that's one way of looking at this Mercury trine Jupiter. The Mercury trine Jupiter could, by the way, say something about relationships. I mean, Mercury is, after all, ruler of Gemini. Gemini is your opposite sign. So with Mercury trine Jupiter, that might be about a relationship developing, perhaps a relationship becoming more serious, more intense, you finding that there is common ground between you and another person. And it's nothing that has to be said. It just becomes obvious. And so it could be quite a meaningful aspect, this Mercury Jupiter contact. And it's not necessarily that anything has to be said, but when you have common ground with another person, it's obvious. And so, although your basic inclination, Sagittarius, is probably to do things on your own, a situation may crop up where it is worth your while getting closer to another person for whatever reason. Capricorn, relationships should not be ignored. There is a conjunction between the Moon and Jupiter this weekend, and this Moon-Jupiter conjunction is taking place in Cancer. Of course, Cancer is your opposite sign. It's a sign that is often connected with relationships, and so other people can be of service. You may be able to benefit from other people. So you don't have to be alone. You don't have to do things on your own. And through contact with the right people, then Capricorn, I think that you can benefit in many different ways, and I think that some people may be ready to do you a favor. In fact, if you need a favor done, then don't be afraid to ask, because you may find that the other person is surprisingly receptive, though people will do things on their terms. That is important to realize. You can't expect people to just do what they're told. I mean, you ask for a favor is not the same as asking someone to completely compromise themselves, to give everything away. That is different, and you need to have a certain amount of respect for other people. Other people are only prepared to go so far. Fundamentally, people will hold to what they believe in. So the reason someone does you a favor is because it doesn't compromise them. It doesn't mean that they have to do anything that is out of character. And when it comes to the important matters, things that are fundamental, well, people are not going to change, and you have to, I think, respect that. So it's not like people are bad, or they are just uncompromising for the sake of it. Instead, there are things that people find to be important, and if something is important, they're not going to let go of it, and they're not going to suddenly change their path. This does mean that there are different types of favors you can ask for someone, but if you ask someone to do something to help you, fine. But if you ask someone to change what they're doing because you don't like what they're doing, for example, they're not going to be very appreciative. Now, this Moon-Jupiter conjunction, it's part of a Grand Trine. We do have a Grand Trine between Mercury, Jupiter, and Saturn. Of course, Saturn is your ruler, so Saturn is involved in this Grand Trine, and with Jupiter and Mercury trining your ruler, this further indicates to me that it really should be easy to get on with people, to benefit from other people. I mean, I've already said that, but the Grand Trine, reinforces that idea. And this means that you should not regard yourself as being an island. It might seem easier to be on an island and not to have to interact, not to have to worry what other people are doing. But I think that might be a wasted opportunity to so really see see what is available, see who is available, and the moon is going to be trine Saturn as well. So Moon trine Saturn is a great aspect for getting on with people, and getting on with perhaps with the people who matter, and at the same time your ability to talk is going to be good. I think there are few subjects that you're not able to say something about, so your natural ability to make conversation is going to encourage people to get closer to you. So I think it should be a weekend where you have people around you, where you can enjoy everyone's company. But then there's always that question: what if there is no one around? What then? Well, it's not just about the social side of things. I mean, Mercury making a trine to Saturn, that might say something about your intelligence. Also, Jupiter making a trine to Saturn. So, other people are aside. I think that your mind is going to be on great form this week, and you're going to be able to see the possibilities, and you can be realistic as well. So you're not going to take risks. You'll know what can be done. And even if you're alone, your mind is going to be moving quickly, and you can really plan ahead in a way that should be very effective. Additionally, you can perhaps take sudden moves. You can do something very quickly, and it might be to do with what you say. So if something is stuck and you feel that things are not moving, your verbal intervention, and it could be an exaggerated intervention where you use a lot of power. You just say something and you give the impression that you're really sure of yourself. Then if you do that, then I think that you'll get everyone's attention, and you can really force the pace if you so wish. Aquarius. Saturn is your ruler, and Saturn in some respects is in the spotlight, because Saturn is part of a Grand Trine. Mercury is trine Saturn, Jupiter is trine Saturn, and with this Grand Trine, I think Aquarius, there's a lot you can do, but it may not seem like fun. So don't necessarily feel you have to have a fun weekend, because there are just better things to be doing. It's not just about mindless enjoyment. It's about whatever it is that you feel that you want to achieve, should have achieved. Perhaps you haven't achieved it so far, but now you may be able to just go that extra mile to ensure that you get what you want. And it is the fact that Saturn is in the spotlight. It's part of a Grand Trine, and Mercury trine Saturn, I would regard that as being a very positive aspect. And don't forget that Mercury is about to leave Scorpio. I mean, Mercury leaves Scorpio next week on the 12th, I think. So the 12th, what's the 12th? That's it. Oh, that's Friday, isn't it? The 12th. I get confused with the dates. So yeah, the end of next week, Mercury does change sign, and the importance of Mercury changing sign is that when Mercury changes sign, it's kind of like the end of something. You've had all these planets moving through Scorpio, and once that sign change happens, you may just lose some of your focus. You have been quite focused, hopefully. There have been things you had really wanted to achieve. You wanted to get them off the ground. Now, it could be the reason you lose focus is that we're getting close to Christmas, and in the sort of couple of weeks before Christmas, people are thinking about other things. You may not get the support you were perhaps used to getting, or perhaps you had the opportunity to get. And so, with this Grand Trine involving Mercury, Jupiter, and Saturn, I think it could be about doing something important, having a weekend where you are thinking about the future, you're planning the future, and where you are, quietly ambitious, and you're getting yourself together, and you're getting yourself together with or without other people. I don't think you need any support, and you're quite capable of controlling things, and working out what needs to be done. And I think that your sense of self-discipline is actually going to be quite good over the weekend. You'll be able to work hard at whatever it is you need to work hard on. I mean, maybe that you need to study something, you need to think about something, maybe you need to write something out. Yeah, you might have to plan. Wherever that work is needed, you will be able to do it, and it might be preparatory, and it might be at in a few days' time, as you move into next week, you'll be able to make the most of what you've done, because you will be properly prepared. So Aquarius, it may not be necessarily an exciting weekend or even a fun weekend, but it could be a weekend where you just accomplish a great deal. And so, really give it your best shot. And if you feel that you're missing an opportunity, or even that you have missed an opportunity, then I think you might have a last chance. And perhaps that's what this weekend, is about. Pisces. The Grand Trine involving Mercury, Jupiter, and Saturn is something that I have been, talking about for some time, and this weekend is when the Mercury Jupiter-Saturn Grand Trine reaches its peak strength. The beginning of a weekend we've got Mercury trine Jupiter, then the end of a weekend, or certainly on Sunday, we've got Mercury trine Saturn, and so that's it. The Grand Trine peaks, and this Grand Trine is very relevant to you because it's in water signs. I'm sorry to be boring. I mean, I've been talking about this for a long time, but that's part of my job. I'm supposed to be telling you what's going on astrologically, what is important to you, Pisces. And you've got Saturn moving through your sign, and so with Saturn moving through your sign, you are disciplined, you are resilient, and you are able to make sense of things, and you can make sense of Mercury and Jupiter. Mercury and Jupiter perhaps represent opportunity, optimism, certainly. But there's plenty of optimism around. Just because you're optimistic doesn't mean anything happens. Optimism can be the prelude to disappointment, but it certainly needn't be, with your Saturn there to help. So you may be able to take something that on the surface doesn't seem to be going anywhere. Maybe it's far-fetched. Maybe it's just not being taken seriously. So you can take something like that, and your Saturn can structure it and give it substance in the real world. And yes, you can make something happen. And additionally, we've got the Moon in Cancer, Moon making a conjunction to Jupiter. So Jupiter's your ruler. You've got Moon with the Moon making a conjunction to Jupiter, and this Moon actually in the end becomes part of the Grand Trine. And so that sort of focuses on what you can do differently, what you can do in an absolutely unique way. So do think about that. You have some very special qualities that are coming to the fore at the moment. Helped by this Grand Trine in water, helped by this conjunction between the Moon and Jupiter, and so it's important to just keep going and to make the most of it all. And also, perhaps you should be thinking about a quincunx between Mars and Jupiter. So Mars and Jupiter are 150 degrees apart, and Mars could represent your ambitions, what you want to do, what you want to achieve. Mars in Sagittarius. Jupiter represents you perhaps as a creative person, particularly as it's conjunct the Moon, someone who has got special qualities. And there could be a certain mismatch between the two, an apparent mismatch between the two. Ambition and creativity seem to perhaps be at odds with one another. I mean, that might sound strange, but I mean, if ambition is seen in a very sort of material way, perhaps as a job, for example, as a career, not something you necessarily want to do, but you feel you have to do it. You've got to move forward in life, but all the while, where is your creativity? Is your creativity being able to be harnessed? And so when you're dealing with a quincunx, the challenge is to bring two elements that appear to be incompatible, to bring them together. And I think that this is something that you can do. You can be yourself. You can also be ambitious. You can be ambitious without compromising your identity, your real self. So, that Mars quincunx Jupiter is something you need to work on. Now, I know it's a weekend, and weekend's supposed to be for relaxing. But, look, when I've been going through the 12 signs, I've been really encouraging people to make the most of this weekend. It's not just about doing nothing. It's not about watching the clouds go by. It's about doing something practical and just making the most of everything that's on offer. And a lot is on offer for you, Pisces. So do use the weekend. Don't let it go to waste. So those are my forecasts for the 12 signs, and now it's time to look at things from the viewpoint of the I Ching. So I ask the question, what is the weekend going to be like for those watching the I Ching section of this video? and the first hexagram I got was hexagram number 2, which is the receptive. And this hexagram is passive. I mean, you look at it, you've got six lines, all of them are broken, and it's not a time to be doing anything creative. When I say creative, things that come from you, things that you initiate. Now that, in a way, completely contradicts some of my forecasts of the 12 signs. So we have to live with contradiction. I mean, of course, the I Ching does represent, a different view. At least that's how one might see it at first sight. But then one thinks about it again, and one thinks, well, what's going on this weekend astrologically? Well, what's going on this weekend astrologically is you've got a Grand Trine in water signs, Mercury, Jupiter, and Saturn coming together, plus the moon. And so when you're thinking about receptive, and you've got a Grand Trine in water, well, the Grand Trine in water is actually quite receptive. Yeah, it can be creative, but it's also receptive, and there's a lot that you have to watch. You have to pick up on it. You have to use your feelings. Some things are not at all obvious, and so you have to really work out what is going on, and just not feel pressurized, not feel that not pressurized you have to do anything in terms of your own identity and who you are as an individual. Because if you're too much of an individual when you've got this hexagram going on, the receptive, that just might be the wrong approach. And we do have the fifth line moving, and the fifth line is a fortunate line, but the fifth line is saying that we are successful, we can be successful. But how are we successful? We're successful because we show an element of discretion. We're not trying to pump up our egos. We're not trying to just be successful for the sake of it. We are just trying to do our best, and it's not about it's not about getting recognized, but we're just calmly showing the universe who we are. We're doing as good a job as we can, and then we get recognized. And it's also important that we don't try to overdo it, or try to demonstrate that we're better than another person, or that try to draw the conversation onto ourselves. We should push that away. We don't want to be at the center of things, but even though we're not at the center of things, we can actually make things happen through this constructive approach. And perhaps we recognize that maybe we are part of a team, part of a wider whole, and this is kind of reflected by the hexagram this moves to, because if we got the fifth line moving, that means that we move to a second hexagram, and the hexagram we move to is hexagram 8, which is holding together. So holding together is about being part of something wider than ourselves. It's not just about our unique personality, our ego. It's suggesting that the best way of dealing with the challenges of the weekend, if there are any challenges, is to be with people, because people can complement each other, and you don't have to feel that you're alone. And so the support is there. You give other people support, they give you support, and it all works out very well. And it's just not about the ego, and that's a key point, particularly with the receptive. Receptive is absolutely not about the ego, feeling we have to get attention, feeling we have to initiate something. We don't. maybe later, but not at the moment. And it's more important that we are just true to ourselves, and we're also true to the people around us. And now I want to go back to the astrology and go back to the Grand Trine in water signs. So looking at the chart for the weekend, here's the Grand Trine. So let's just remind ourselves of what we're seeing. Yes, you can actually see the triangular shape there of the Grand Trine. There is Jupiter, trine Mercury, and that's trine Saturn. So, I've talked about this Grand Trine already and what I think about it. I think that the Jupiter-Saturn trine is an important stage in the Jupiter-Saturn cycle. Remember, we had the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction was the end of 2020 at 0 degrees Aquarius, and there is 20 years between two Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions. And so, as the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction sort of unfolds, we see the sort of alternation between growth and recession and optimism and pessimism. And we have to look at this conjunction in terms of the opposition, because after 10 years after the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, we get an opposition. So there's going to be a Jupiter-Saturn opposition in 2029, and I think that's when it starts. And the opposition can be difficult. It can be when the Jupiter-Saturn cycle goes into crisis. And at the beginning of the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction is when we're getting used to something new. Jupiter-Saturn conjunction this time around, it coincided with COVID. And COVID did mess people up in all sorts of ways. The world has not recovered from COVID. And when you have the trine following the conjunction, very often it's something positive, at least in the short term. Certainly, at least in terms of the markets, it can be very positive. And it doesn't necessarily last forever. For example, you would have had a Jupiter-Saturn trine in the Roaring '20s, and then as Jupiter moved towards the opposition of Saturn, it all fell apart with the October 29 crash. And so it can have something to do with the markets. And so Mercury forming part of this Grand Trine is giving us an awareness of what is happening, of what is developing in the world. I think it is about the world, this Jupiter-Saturn trine. It's about us and our own lives. It can be, but Jupiter-Saturn, I do think it is about the business cycle. It's about economics. It's about society. And with Mercury on this Grand Trine, with Mercury forming a Grand Trine, we can really start to understand things. So on a personal level, one way to use this Mercury on Jupiter-Saturn midpoint is to try to understand, to read the news, to be aware of the news. What are people saying? It's all out there. We can perhaps even get an idea about what's happening in the world by looking at the news and by being aware of what people are saying, what politicians are saying, and that information, sure, is available for us. Now, as far as the markets are concerned, I don't really make stock market predictions, but there is a view that the markets will continue to go up. People are talking about liquidity increasing, that governments, they need to have money printing, particularly in the US. Donald Trump is looking for lower interest rates. He wants a new Fed. Well, there is going to be a new Fed chair, and of course the Fed chair is going to be his pick, someone who's going to reduce interest rates, get that economy going, because we're looking at the 2026 the 2026 midterms. Trump wants to do as well as possible in those midterms. And so now with Mercury aspecting with Jupiter-Saturn, it's all coming together, and we're seeing a great deal of talk about the economy. People. Okay, sure, a lot of people are afraid. We've got a Saturn-Neptune conjunction at the moment. Heliocentrically, that Saturn-Neptune conjunction is very close. A lot of people are saying, "Oh, things are going to fall apart," but certainly in terms of the markets, I don't think they are going to fall apart. In my opinion, I'm not giving any advice here. This channel, as I always say, is for entertainment purposes only. But Mercury allows us to understand, what is happening, and I think that's part of what this Grand Trine is about. And so, if we want to, for example, talk about politics, talk about the world, talk about economics, now might be a good time. Get a discussion going, see what other people have to say. Now, one midpoint we have, because this is Mercury on a Jupiter-Saturn midpoint. Mercury is part of this Grand Trine in water signs. We've got Mercury on the Jupiter-Saturn midpoint, and I wanted to look at a few examples of Mercury on a Jupiter-Saturn midpoint. I think this is a useful exercise. Well, it's a useful exercise for me. Maybe it's not such a useful exercise for you, but I just think it's good to just look at one midpoint and to look at examples of people who have this midpoint. Ask ourselves, does this work? And also sort of a few events. And I think that if you do have Mercury on a Jupiter-Saturn midpoint, the way I would see it would be that you could be a person who is very influenced by world events. You really take it on board. It can influence your life, trends and so forth that you just can't ignore. And when we're talking about on the Mercury on the Jupiter-Saturn midpoint, remember we're talking about conjunctions, oppositions, squares, semi-squares, and sesquiquadrates. That dynamic series of aspects. Now, Reinhold Ebertin, in a combination of stellar influences, that's always a good starting point. He says of Mercury on a Jupiter-Saturn midpoint, Mercury on Jupiter-Saturn midpoint, the search for variety and change, inconstancy of mind and philosophy of life, the desire to make changes, a fortunate separation, a journey. So the inconstancy of mind and philosophy of life, I think you can see why he would be saying that, because Jupiter and Saturn are two principles, that appear to be very opposite to one another. Jupiter is a principle of expansion. Saturn is a principle of contraction. So you bring those together, and you could say that there's something inconsistent about it. Do we stop? Do we start? Do we grow? Do we decline? What are we going to do? What's our position here? But that also reflects the economy, and with Mercury on a Jupiter-Saturn midpoint, people don't know. People can be incredibly optimistic about the economy. Well, particularly in the U.S. U.S. is a larger economy. The dollar is still the reserve currency. Maybe in other countries there isn't so much optimism, but that perhaps also reflects the inconsistency of Jupiter and Saturn. We might as well look at what Alfred Witter says about it, whether he says anything too different about it. So Alfred Witter says about Mercury on a Jupiter-Saturn, he says, joyful parting, to realize a thought, house hunting. House hunting? Well, okay, it's a good weekend for house hunting, according to Alfred Witter. I don't really buy that interpretation. He talks about departure. Maybe it's a time for saying goodbye. But anyway, as far as a few people who have Mercury on a Jupiter-Saturn midpoint are concerned, one person is Graham Linehan. So Graham Linehan, he was in the news recently because he was stopped by the police at Heathrow. And so Graham Linehan is sort of a comedian, and he wrote Father Ted, for example, and he was a really important figure in comedy, but he got cancelled because of his views on the trans issues. He basically took the view that a woman is a woman, and this meant that people sort of cancelled things with him, and he was really persona non grata. And then he got stopped at Heathrow, and because of what he tweeted about the trans. So how does that work? So if you've got Mercury on a Jupiter-Saturn midpoint, you could say that someone who has Mercury on a Jupiter-Saturn midpoint understands the society in which they live and understands the pressures in that society and what is important, and that might be quite good if you are a comedy writer. I mean, I don't know, I've never been to Ireland, but I mean, Father Ted was perhaps saying something about the Catholic Church in Ireland. I mean, it wasn't a particularly biting series. It was very good natured, but something about the changing nature of the Catholic Church in Ireland, losing some of its power and its respect. So that might have been a part of it, and so he was sensitive to that. And then with the trans issues, likewise, it became important to him. It was something that he got involved with. So that might be how Mercury on a Jupiter-Saturn midpoint works. You can get carried away. I mean, I don't think he got carried away because he was acting as an individual. Another person who had Mercury on the Jupiter-Saturn midpoint was the German industrialist Hans Martin Schleyer. And Hans Martin Schleyer was kidnapped and assassinated by the Red Brigades, and so there's his Mercury. No, was it Red Brigades or by the Baader-Meinhof gang? One of those sort of 70s urban terrorist gangs. I think it was the Baader-Meinhof gang. But so there's his Mercury and there's his Jupiter-Saturn. So you can see it's right on the midpoint. So he may be very much a person of his times. He will identify with whatever's going at the time. So during the Second World War, he got involved in the Nazis. I think with the Nazis, he was, I believe, he was an officer in the SS, and because that was the right thing to do for him. It felt like for him it was the right thing to do. So obviously, if you want progress, you join the SS, and then later on after the war, you do what you get involved with Germany, the growing German industrial capacity. I think he was invited, and he was sort of advising industrialists on how to treat unions, and he was seen as being quite a sort of an anti-union figure. He was, I think, very much hated in Stuttgart, where I think Stuttgart was where his stamping ground was, and in the end, he was kidnapped by I think the Baader-Meinhof gang, and he's kind of seen as a bit of a martyr somehow, but at the time, a lot of people really hated him in Germany, certainly those on the left. But anyway, he got assassinated. And what's kind of interesting about it is that what was assassinated, well, he was abducted, and then during his abduction, a lot of the Baader-Meinhof gang killed themselves in prison, and so his abductors responded to this by killing him, and so Martin Schleyer's abduction is also of certain relevance. So there's Martin Schleyer with his Mercury on the Jupiter-Saturn midpoint, but maybe he kind of resonates to that as well. So here's a chart of his abduction, and in this case, Mercury was making a semi-square to the Jupiter-Saturn midpoint when he was abducted. So again, Mercury on a Jupiter-Saturn midpoint, it's a sign of the times. The late 70s, urban terrorism in Germany, people like him being targeted, but maybe him having that Mercury on a Jupiter-Saturn midpoint, he was receptive to the cycle. It's like with Epstein. I mean, Epstein had the moon on the on the Mars-Saturn midpoint, and he killed himself when Mars was making an aspect to when the moon was aspecting the Mars-Saturn midpoint. And continuing on the theme of Nazis and communication, there is Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, and you can see that his Mercury was exactly on the Mars-Saturn midpoint. Exactly on the Jupiter-Saturn midpoint. So you can see that Goebbels was born with a Jupiter-Saturn sextile. So Goebbels, born on a Jupiter-Saturn sextile, it's a fortunate aspect. Jupiter-Saturn. Jupiter-Saturn may represent someone who was able to take advantage of whatever was going on in the times in which he was living. And Mercury on a Jupiter-Saturn midpoint means that he was really in touch with it. So he was a journalist. So that makes sense, a journalist and a writer with Mercury on a Jupiter-Saturn midpoint. And Mercury is, of course, also the planet of communication, the planet of propaganda. So I do think that fits pretty well. And with Goebbels, you're thinking about Jupiter is perhaps the optimism there, but Saturn is also has the capacity to see the truth of the matter. And I think Goebbels, if you look at Goebbels' diaries, he was aware that Germany was losing the war before most other people. He could see the way things were going. He understood with Mercury on a Jupiter-Saturn how people were going to respond. So, for example, when the Germans dug up the victims of the Catine Forest massacre, when of course these Polish officers thousands of Polish officers were massacred by the Soviets, and their bodies were found lying around. When it was the Germans who found these bodies, he wrote in his diaries that he wouldn't be surprised if the Soviets blame the Germans for killing them. And of course that is exactly what happened. And for decades it was thought that the Nazis had killed these officers, when in fact it was the Soviets. And so I think that he certainly is a really good example of Mercury on Mercury conjunct the Jupiter-Saturn midpoint. Now, on a more positive note, Mercury is not just about propaganda. It can be about music. It can be about singing. And sort of Paul McCartney has Mercury on a Jupiter-Saturn midpoint. You can see that by eye. Mercury in Gemini. It's a very talkative place. It's a very playful place for Mercury. And so maybe Mercury on a Jupiter-Saturn midpoint, with him, he was able to tune into the times in which he was living. And so if you are a rock star or a budding rock star, it's very important to be able to tune into the Geist, to be able to tune into the spirit with one's mind and one's artistic output. And so I think that's an example of how Mercury on a Jupiter-Saturn midpoint can work pretty well. And Steve McQueen as well. He has Steve McQueen. I mean, he's been dead for a long time, but as an actor, he was pretty iconic in the 60s, The Great Escape and Bullet. He represented perhaps at some level the spirit of the 60s, doing whatever he liked. Speed. Of course, he was really into cars, and he had Mercury. There you can see he had Mercury on the Jupiter-Saturn midpoint. So that is an idea about Mercury on a Jupiter-Saturn midpoint, just being in accord with the times. and of course the times can shift, and you can suddenly be out of date. I mean, that's always possible. And someone who is around right now is J.D. Vance. So here is J.D. Vance's chart. So in this case, J.D. Vance, there's his Jupiter-Saturn. His Mercury is square his Mars-Saturn midpoint. So when you think about how Vance is communicating, obviously Vance is quite strident in terms of what he says. He doesn't care about who he offends, and he is someone who is popular amongst a certain segment of American voters, and he is in tune with the times. I know a lot of people hate Vance. Maybe half the American population hate Vance, but then you don't need it doesn't matter if the other half think he's wonderful. So Vance is perhaps able at some level to resonate to the American people, or at least half the American people, and maybe when he runs for president, I think it's pretty likely that he's going to run for president. It's going to be the Republican nominee. I think it's also pretty likely that he gets elected. So that is an advantage, up to a point until things turn against him. But he can communicate in a way that can grab the popular attention and get support. So yeah, that's another example of Mercury Mercury hitting a Jupiter-Saturn midpoint being current and understanding the dynamics of the times in which one is living. And even more so is the case of Elon Musk. So here's a horoscope of Elon Musk. So Elon Musk, he has Mercury. There's his Mercury, a very strong Mercury, by the way. He's got Mercury in Mercury in Cancer, in mutual reception with the moon in Virgo. And the Jupiter-Saturn midpoint is at about sort of 29 Leo, something like that. So his Mercury is exactly semi-square the Jupiter-Saturn midpoint, and that sums him up completely. I mean, Elon Musk is always trying to position himself in the place which makes himself most current. He's always interested. He's always interested in the latest thing. So I don't actually think that Elon Musk is an innovator. I mean, people say he's an innovator. I don't think he actually is, but he's very, very sensitive. His mind is sensitive as well to what is popular at a particular time. A very useful thing to know if you're in business. But the way he got into cryptocurrency, Dogecoin. Then he pursued a lot of Trump's agenda, Doge, cutting public expenditure. All his views. He's trying to be current, and that is what Mercury on a Jupiter-Saturn midpoint very often is about. So those are a few people who have Mercury aspecting the Jupiter-Saturn midpoint. I think there is a theme there. I mean, I know that there is selection bias, and astrologers are very good at creating meaning out of things, but I think there is a theme there of people who are trying to pick up on what's going on in the body politic, in the society, in the economy. They're trying very hard. Now, as far as a few events are concerned, I mean, if you're talking about events which perhaps in themselves should be iconic, perhaps events which mark the beginning of something or the end of something, or which represent sort of a tension that really can't be avoided. So, for example, in 1923, when Hitler attempted to seize power in Munich in the beer hall putsch, which of course ended him spending some time in prison. But at the time of the beer hall putsch, Mercury was on a Jupiter-Saturn midpoint. So the event of the Bierhol Putsch sort of picked up on what was going on in Germany at the time. It gave voice to what was going on in Germany, but it all spilled over into this attempt in which Hitler tried to take power in Munich. I mean, it was probably a pretty hopeless thing to do, but he was still sort of expressing something, and it said something about the underlying, dynamics. And it can also talk about, it can also be about, what society becomes obsessed about. Like, for example, ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt society has, every now and then become obsessed about ancient Egypt. And the opening or the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb took place with Mercury on the Jupiter-Saturn midpoint. Egypt has always captured our imagination. I mean, Egypt. It started at the beginning of the 19th century with I think, with the discovery of a Rosetta Stone and other artifacts in Egypt, maybe during Napoleon's adventures there. But it still continues. But I think the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb really renewed interest in ancient Egypt, and so that was an iconic cultural event, the discovery of this tomb. So it's kind of not surprising that Mercury was on the Jupiter-Saturn midpoint. It might also be about the ending of something. I mean, the realization, for example, that space shuttles are not such a way of not such a good way of traveling. Okay, we had Challenger in 1986, but maybe that was a one-off. But then we had the Columbia disaster. So the Columbia disaster was when the heat shield broke up and this space shuttle, disintegrated while trying to get back into Earth's atmosphere. And Mercury was there's Jupiter. Mercury was opposition the Jupiter-Saturn midpoint. So again, that may be saying something about the end of the space shuttle program. I mean, I'm not saying that one can necessarily read too much into that, or the start of something, the start of the Afghan war. I mean, there are two wars that started with Mercury on a Jupiter-Saturn midpoint. One was when the Soviets piled into Afghanistan in 1979. And so here, Mercury was square the Jupiter-Saturn midpoint. So this was, I mean, certainly an important event. You could say that it was a marker in terms of the decline of the Soviet Union. I mean, I don't think the Afghan war was the real reason why the Soviet Union collapsed. I mean, some would say it was just the fact that there was a collapse in the oil price. It was as simple as that. I mean, that might have been it. The Soviet Union was very dependent on commodity prices, but doing this with Mercury on a Jupiter-Saturn midpoint, it's just it's very, again, I think it is iconic, and it's a sign of a change, and it also links with the fact that there is a Jupiter-Saturn Jupiter-Saturn conjunction forming, and that Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, which sort of formed, I don't know, I think it was exact in 1980, 81, was a mark of a new cycle, and it was a mark of a real decline of the Soviet Union. And by the Jupiter-Saturn opposition, that's when everything collapsed. And so Mercury on the Jupiter-Saturn midpoint was reflecting this. So it was a sign that things were changing. And so it's one day, December, Christmas Day, 1979, but it was still linking into something wider and sort of more collective. And it did link with the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. So those are a few thoughts about Mercury on the Jupiter-Saturn midpoint. It is really fundamentally about the Jupiter-Saturn, but Mercury is giving voice to the Jupiter-Saturn. It's telling us perhaps what that Jupiter-Saturn conjunction is all about. So perhaps if we want to know about the Jupiter-Saturn cycle that we're in since 2020, we should perhaps look at what's happening over the next few days while Mercury is conjunct the Jupiter-Saturn midpoint. So thank you very much for watching this video. If you enjoyed this video, I'd be very grateful if you were to like it. If you're not subscribed, I'd be super grateful if you were to subscribe. If you want to buy me a coffee, there's a link in the description. And I will talk to you again very soon.